There's much debate among scholars and the academia of who wrote the Gospel of Matthew. Pretty much the gist of it is they just don't know. They're pretty confident that it wasn't Matthew, but they just don't really know who it is. Let me get a seat here. I'm going to tell you a little story. I used to be a framer. Yeah, I used to be a framer. What are you expecting? Some kind of scholar with all his books behind him? So there's one time I was framing, right? And some homeowner comes wandering onto the site. And he's got these custom plans for this house that he wants me to frame. And I'm looking over the prints. This looks very familiar. And I call over one of the guys who's working with me because he's framed for one of the other builders for years. And I'm like, hey, come over here. Is this a Bonneville? To one of the models that he had framed for years. Because even now, this was a custom redone model print, and it wasn't set to Cedar Glen or anything like that on the prints. It was obviously a Bonneville. I knew it, he knew it. I bet you that homeowner even knew it. He just kind of lifted the prints off the plans. That gets me back to Matthew. So, as I said, most scholars just don't think the Apostle Matthew wrote the Gospel of Matthew, and they have some good reasons for this. Probably the most prominent and strongest one to consider is the very fact that he copies so much of Mark. Like about 90% of the Gospel of Mark is in the Gospel of Matthew, which really makes it feel like if Matthew's the first eyewitness here, like he's lived through all his experience, why does he lift so much of it from another author? And then on top of that is the strangeness of his calling. So Mark tells the story of Jesus calling Matthew the tax collector to come and follow him. And Matthew pretty much copies this story verbatim, word for word from Mark. If that's his own story of how Jesus called him to follow him, why does he copy it so much? Just doesn't quite smell right, as my shop teacher would say. But back to the Bonneville thing. So throughout most of church history, that is the era since Jesus came on the earth, Jesus was on earth, whatever you want to call it there, is the church and most scholars and church fathers and apologists and all these kind of people, theologians, accredit the Gospel of Matthew to the Apostle Matthew. Even though, like I say, this information doesn't quite jive very well together. So, like for example, Papias, very loosely paraphrased, I'll put it on the screen the full exact wording, but he says in short that Matthew wrote first in the Hebrew language. And there's much debate on exactly what the Hebrew language goes for. But then it doesn't quite seem to jive with what we know about the Gospel of Matthew. But this is my thought. Back to the Bonneville blueprints. I wonder, is it the simple fact that yes, the Apostle Matthew, which is very an exception that he would be literate, because Robin Faith Welsh says that less than 3% of the population is literate. And if we give you that, the 120 in the upper room, 3, maybe 4 could be literate. Matthew, John, James, and maybe one other guy. So it is a possibility. Let's write that off right off the bat. But then let's think about this through. So what if he did write a gospel, or at least a collection of sayings, which often are contributed as Q, Quella, in the German? But what if we actually said that was Matthew wrote these down? And then the editor, the author of the Gospel of Matthew that you and I know, took it and meshed it together, merged it with the Gospel of Mark. There's more narratives with these teachings of Jesus and merged the two together, making them one. So he was not Matthew. But then anybody who reading this text would look at it and go, that's Matthew. I've read this before. This is Matthew. Regardless of what the name would say on it, which all of them are anonymous until they say the gospel according to Matthew. Maybe that's a better way of looking at it than just to write it off and say, we just don't know. How can we say? Just a thought. It's a Bonneville.